What if the stories we've always read as myth were never meant to be myths? You may have heard of the Ark of the Covenant, a golden chest said to hold the 10 Commandments, veiled in ritual, hidden for centuries. But pause for a moment and consider. Why would ancient texts describe something so sacred, yet so dangerous? Why did it have to be carried with poles, never touched? Why did it emit deadly flashes of light? Why did it leave a trail of death when mishandled? Some say it was divine. Others whisper it was something far more technical. Could the Ark have been more than a holy relic? A machine from a forgotten age? Perhaps even a nuclear device? We're not here to draw conclusions, only to listen to the echoes, the fragments, the strange silences of history. And in that silence, ask the questions no one dares to voice aloud. So lay your head down, slow your breath, and follow the thread. You're listening to Historic Sleep. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. It begins not with an explosion, but with a silence. The kind of silence that spreads in the absence of memory. When an artifact vanishes, and the words used to describe it grow cautious, blurred, softened, or stripped from the record. The Ark of the Covenant is one such artifact, described in vivid detail, and yet somehow always just beyond reach. According to the Hebrew Bible, it was a sacred chest of acacia wood, overlaid with pure gold. Carried through the desert by the Israelites, it led armies and parted waters. It was their link to the divine, and it was not to be touched. But that's the part that stands out. Why the danger? In the book of Samuel, Uzzah, a man whose only mistake was steadying the ark as it threatened to fall, is struck dead instantly, not by a soldier, not by a sword, but by the ark itself. The account says the anger of the Lord was kindled against him. But if we read without preconceptions, if we strip the language of devotion, what do we see? A man touches an object, and he dies immediately. No struggle, no delay, no wound, only contact, and then silence. That kind of death is not unfamiliar to modern science. It's rare, but it's known. A high-intensity radiation surge, like one from an unshielded nuclear source, can kill a man almost instantly, not with heat or explosion, but with invisible force. We saw this during the early years of nuclear experimentation in the 20th century. The physicists called it the demon core. The smallest slip, a tool misplaced, a hand too close, and death would follow in days, sometimes hours. But the Ark, if it existed, would have predated that by over 3,000 years. So we're left with a dissonance. How could an object from the Bronze Age behave like something born of atomic science? Are the texts merely metaphor? Is the lightning and death and fire simply the language of awe? Or did ancient witnesses see something they could not explain, and so called it divine? Here's where the mystery deepens. The descriptions of the Ark include some very particular and very peculiar features. It's said to have 2 golden cherubim on top, winged figures whose wings stretched toward one another, creating a kind of lid. Between those wings, the presence of God would speak. A voice, not from within, but from above, from the space between. Modern engineers might call that space a discharge point. And those gold-covered poles, permanently affixed, ensured that no human hand would ever touch the ark directly. Contact was forbidden, and not for symbolic reasons. Death was immediate. Not just to those outside the priesthood, but even to priests themselves, if the ritual was not precisely observed. That's a level of risk management you don't often see with ceremonial boxes. In fact, the ancient instructions for transporting the ark resemble a checklist for handling dangerous equipment. Do not touch the surface, use only insulated handlers, maintain distance, follow specific protocols, or face fatal consequences. It does not sound like reverence alone. It sounds like containment. And there's more. The ark was said to be housed, when stationary, in a specially constructed tent called the tabernacle. This was not a simple covering. It had layers, animal hides, linens, golden clasps, and detailed compartmentalization. Only specific people could enter. Only certain times of year. And inside the Holy of Holies, where the ark rested, even the high priest had to purify himself repeatedly before entry. A mistake here didn't just mean excommunication, it meant death. Now imagine a small, ancient community building what amounts to a controlled access room, a space with shielding, isolation, ritualized protocols, and a strict personnel policy. And all for a box of golden wood? Unless it wasn't just golden wood. Unless what it contained, or was dangerous in a way those people could not fully comprehend. Perhaps not because of divine wrath, but because of energy. Real, unstable energy. Of course, this raises more questions than it answers. And it leads us down paths that mainstream historians tend to avoid, because the implications are difficult. How could a Bronze Age tribe possess, or even come into contact with, technology that mimics a nuclear effect? Some suggest outside influence, that perhaps remnants of an older, forgotten civilization passed such devices along. Others argue for an entirely different vector, an intervention, a contact, a transmission of knowledge not native to the time. These are the fringe edges of history. But they are not without evidence. For example, in multiple ancient cultures across continents, we find similar taboos around sacred objects, warnings of death, prohibitions against touch, rituals for containment. In India's Mahabharata, weapons are described that seem to mimic modern missiles and radiation. In Mesopotamian myth, there are devices guarded by beings of fire. In Ethiopia, to this day, a church claims to house the ark itself, and only one monk is allowed to see it. He never leaves the compound. He never speaks to outsiders. Why? What is it that we fear thousands of years later that might still rest inside that box? Or perhaps the more haunting question is this: what happened to the knowledge of how it worked? Because even in the biblical record, the ark vanishes. After the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, it is never mentioned again as a physical object. No destruction, no looting, no transport, just absence. Something that central, that powerful, and it disappears without a trace. Is it possible that the disappearance of the ark was not a simple act of loss, but part of a larger effort to remove dangerous knowledge? To bury something too powerful to be left in human hands? Or was it buried not by design, but by disaster? A collapse, a rupture in memory, a rewriting of what could not be understood. The ark becomes a myth, and yet even now, the stories persist. So we begin here, at the edge of memory, with an object that should not exist, and yet somehow shapes the world that followed. And maybe, just maybe, the next layer of dust we brush away will reveal more than gold. It might reveal the true nature of power. The silence around the ark is not simply absence, it is carefully maintained. Like a room swept clean too thoroughly, or a book whose missing pages have been neatly torn, not carelessly lost. After its last biblical appearance, in the time of the prophet Jeremiah, the ark seems to fall off the edge of history. No record of its destruction, no account of its seizure by foreign armies, no concrete mention of it ever again being seen, touched, or even spoken of with certainty. Why? To misplace a golden chest would be odd enough. But to forget something so central, so powerful, that it once guided an entire people through war and wilderness? That demands scrutiny. In cultures where oral memory was sacred, where generations passed knowledge with a near liturgical precision, such a disappearance is not an oversight. It is an omission, intentional or imposed. And here we must pause, not for answers, but for a deeper kind of question. Who would benefit from the ark vanishing into myth? Who gains when dangerous knowledge is not destroyed, but merely reclassified as fiction? There are those who argue that the priesthood itself had motive, that as time passed and memory of the ark's true nature faded, its risk outweighed its value, that it no longer aligned with the evolving structure of organized faith, a device too uncontrollable, too misunderstood, too easily misused. And so it was hidden, or perhaps dismantled, sealed away in layers of stone and silence. But there is another possibility, darker and more elusive, that the ark didn't just vanish from memory, it was erased. And not just from one culture's texts, but from collective awareness, like a file overwritten, not deleted, a deliberate act of suppression. We have seen this elsewhere. The Library of Alexandria, burned not once, but multiple times, its losses blamed on accident, conquest, or religious zeal. The records of entire civilizations, Minoan, Olmec, even parts of the Indus Valley, collapsed into mystery. Languages never decoded, scripts abandoned, whole traditions devoured by time. But time, as we know, is not always the culprit. Sometimes it's the gatekeepers of knowledge. Institutions, both religious and secular, have long exercised power not just by what they teach, but by what they choose not to. And if the Ark of the Covenant was more than myth, if it was indeed a form of ancient technology, then its suppression would not be unprecedented. It would be strategic. In the medieval period, the Church classified any notion of lost advanced knowledge as heresy. Forbidden texts were sealed, apocryphal writings excluded from the canon, and scientific thinkers silenced or rebranded as mystics. The narrative had to remain clean, simple, divinely orchestrated. Anything else would invite the wrong kind of questions. And questions are dangerous, especially the ones that cannot be answered using the approved vocabulary. So perhaps the Ark was buried not beneath desert sands, but beneath semantics, hidden in plain sight, reinterpreted, mistranslated, reframed as a symbol rather than a mechanism. This wouldn't be the first time. Across multiple cultures, we find tales of divine weapons, heavenly chariots, forbidden fire, and voices that thunder without form, objects that kill without contact, visions that burn the eyes. Even Plato's dialogues speak of Atlantis, a civilization destroyed by its own unchecked ambition. The story has always been read as allegory. But what if it wasn't? What if the Ark, and other lost devices like it, belonged to a forgotten chapter of human civilization? One that rose high enough to create, or inherit, technologies beyond its capacity to sustain? We know civilizations are fragile. The collapse of the Roman Empire led to a millennium of technological regression in Europe. In a matter of generations, advanced aqueduct systems, surgical instruments, and civic engineering were reduced to legend. Lost not because they were too primitive, but because they were too sophisticated to replicate without their scaffolding. Could something similar have happened in a more distant past? Could the Ark be a relic of a pre-collapse world? There are scattered clues, fragments that don't quite fit the mainstream timeline. In South Africa, mines tens of thousands of years old. In Iraq, ancient batteries made of copper and clay. In India, Sanskrit texts describing aerial vehicles called vimanas and weapons that resemble energy blasts. The evidence is contested, often dismissed, but it persists. And like all anomalies, it draws a line. One side demands conformity, the other asks, what are we missing? Because if the Ark was indeed a power source, if its purpose was not religious symbolism, but energy containment, then everything changes. Its rituals become safety protocols. Its housing becomes a protective chamber. Its silence becomes strategic. But silence, too, degrades over time. Whispers begin to return. Local legends, persistent claims. In Ethiopia, the town of Axum guards a small, ancient chapel said to house the true Ark. The guardian of the Ark is a monk who never leaves the chapel grounds. No one else is allowed inside. No photos, no inspection, only stories. The air around the chapel is thick with reverence and tension. There are tales, always whispered, that strange illnesses befall those who come too close, that priests rotate quickly, unable to endure the proximity, that during one attempted invasion, a beam of light was seen shooting from the chapel, blinding attackers. No proof, but again, no disproof. We are left with this, a handful of descriptions, a vanishing object, and a pattern of suppression. And one unavoidable truth. Wherever it is now, if it still exists, the Ark is no longer discussed by scholars with ease. The conversation is redirected, the topic dismissed, the evidence thinned by mockery, which is precisely what we'd expect if it were real, because real power rarely leaves marks on paper. It leaves voids, gaps, and echoes, and so the mystery of the Ark deepens, not by new discovery, but by what we have failed to preserve. What is kept from us often speaks loudest. And as we drift through that silence, a question remains. What if the loss of the Ark wasn't an accident of history, but a choice? There's something strange about the way we remember. We imagine the past as something solid, chiseled in stone, catalogued in scrolls, layered in sediment. But memory isn't like that. It isn't fixed. It bends around power. It shifts with belief. And when it comes to the Ark of the Covenant, memory seems to bend a little too neatly. If the Ark was once so central, so fearsome, why is its trail not just cold, but curiously quiet? After all, this was not a minor relic. It was the beating heart of the Israelite identity. Its presence was said to guarantee victory in the battle, its absence, despair. But after the Babylonian conquest, there is no record of it being taken. No mention in Babylonian plunder lists, which otherwise are detailed and boastful. The Ark does not appear in royal inventories, nor is it described in prophetic lament. It doesn't even get a proper goodbye. It just stops. This silence invites suspicion. Historians often explain such disappearances with the chaos of war. Temples burn, priests scatter, records perish, but that kind of loss leaves fragments, ash, debate, speculation, The Ark leaves none of that. Instead, it leaves ritual-shaped holes. The Second Temple, rebuilt after the Babylonian exile, was grand, even majestic. But it lacked the Ark, and yet the religious structure moved forward as if it never existed. The Holy of Holies stood empty. The Day of Atonement was performed without the central relic that once gave it meaning. An entire faith adapted to an absence. Quietly. Smoothly. Why? One theory suggests that the Ark was hidden intentionally by those who feared it falling into foreign hands. But if that were true, if its guardians had preserved it, would they not have passed on its location, or at least its image, to inspire the generations? Unless they couldn't. Unless whatever the Ark truly was could no longer be approached. Radiation sickness, as we now know it, can cause symptoms that in ancient times might have been interpreted as curses. Nausea, blindness, bleeding, death within days. If the Ark was leaking or had destabilized, its keepers may have sealed it away to protect themselves. Not with ceremony, but with distance. And that distance became silence. There's another possibility, one that disturbs even more. What if the Ark was never meant to be understood by those who possessed it? What if it was an inheritance, not of divine favor, but of forgotten engineering? Let's go back for a moment. The instructions for building the Ark, as described in the book of Exodus, are incredibly precise. Measurements in cubits, materials specified down to purity. Gold here, acacia there. The account reads less like a legend and more like a technical manual. No other artifact in biblical text receives such exhaustive attention. And yet, those instructions were relayed to Moses during his time on Mount Sinai. 40 days and nights in isolation, speaking to a presence hidden in cloud and fire. Was it vision, revelation, or transmission? Ancient astronaut theories often push this line too far, too fast. But even without invoking otherworldly beings, we can ask a grounded question. Is it possible that Moses, or someone close to him, encountered a remnant of technology and mistook its function as instruction? He would not have been the first. Throughout history, humans encountering unfamiliar tools have often interpreted them through the lens of religion or magic. Cargo cults in the Pacific Islands built mock airstrips after World War II, believing the aircraft were divine. In their view, the radios and rifles left behind by soldiers weren't tools, but gifts from the gods. Now imagine a desert-bound people discovering an object they cannot build, but can carry. It responds to ritual. It kills when mishandled. It demands precision, submission, distance. What frame of reference could they possibly have? It would have to become sacred. And when it became unmanageable or began to fail, the response would not be repair. It would be reverence or fear. This brings us to a strange connection buried in an unlikely place, the temples of ancient Egypt. Some scholars have long noted similarities between the Ark and ceremonial boxes used in Egyptian ritual processions. Small shrines on poles, covered in gold, carried by priests. But there is one critical difference. Those boxes didn't kill. They were symbolic, decorative. Still, the visual parallel is too close to ignore. Moses, we know, was raised in Pharaoh's household. His familiarity with Egyptian rites was likely deep. Could it be that the form of the Ark, its design, its aesthetic, was inspired by Egypt, but its function came from something far older? Perhaps Moses saw both, a ritual shape and a mysterious source of energy. And in trying to house one within the other, he created the ark as we now half remember it. But if so, where did the core come from? There is no mention of the Israelites constructing any complex mechanism inside the ark. No description of inner parts, only the exterior. What if the core already existed, salvaged, stolen, or discovered, and the ark was built to contain it? This idea is not new. Throughout ancient texts, there are references to stones that spoke, lights that burned without flame, and voices from the void. Most are dismissed as metaphor. But again, the metaphors are oddly consistent. They describe objects that emit sound and light, respond to touch, and require strict handling. Some are buried after use. Others are lost in catastrophe. Could these all be fragments of a single truth? That in the deep past, there existed not a civilization like ours, but a scatter of knowledge, an echo, passed along in pieces. The Ark of the Covenant, then, may not have been unique, only uniquely remembered. And perhaps that's why it vanished, because someone, somewhere, realized what it was. Not a relic, not a symbol, but a threat. The silence grows louder, the deeper we listen. And as the centuries move further from the moment the ark last appeared, the stories do not fade. They multiply, each one insisting that the object is real, that it still exists, hidden beneath desert sands or temple floors. But if it does, the final question is not where. It's whether we're ready to find it again. There's a pattern that emerges once you begin to trace the ark, not through theology, but through fear. Wherever its presence is recorded, fear follows. Cities tremble, armies falter, and those who come too near it either flee or fall. It's not the reverent awe reserved for holy relics, but something colder, like the instinctive recoil from a live wire or the hush that settles before a storm you can't see but feel coming. In the first book of Samuel, the Philistines capture the ark after defeating Israel in battle. It should have been a triumph. Instead, they are plagued with tumors, panic, and death. The city of Ashdod suffers, and the ark is passed from one Philistine city to another, like a cursed object. No one can keep it. Eventually they return it, desperate to rid themselves of the thing. Here again the language is ceremonial, cloaked in divine causality. But set the scripture aside for a moment and focus on the events. An object is introduced into a population. Within days, illness spreads. Not a vague sickness, but physical symptoms, swelling, pain, fatal conditions. Livestock die. The air grows wrong. This is not an unfamiliar scene, not to us. In 1987, in Goiânia, Brazil, a scrap metal scavenger opened a discarded radiotherapy machine. Inside was a small, glowing capsule containing cesium-137. The blue light was mesmerizing. Children played with it. People touched it with bare hands. Over the next few days, over 100,000 people were monitored. 4 died. Hundreds more were contaminated. Homes were destroyed. Soil removed. The event became one of the worst radiological disasters in history. And yet, it began with something small, glowing, and seemingly magical. The ark never glowed. But it didn't need to. Its presence alone inspired unease. The Israelites knew to handle it with precise ritual, even distance. The Philistines did not. Their ignorance, or perhaps their curiosity, proved fatal. But what exactly were they exposed to? Some suggest radiation. Others speculate about electromagnetic emissions. The truth is, we don't know. But what's compelling is the consistency of consequence, exposure followed by biological damage. That correlation, across texts, cultures, centuries, demands attention. Even the rituals surrounding the ark's return are peculiar. The Philistines place it on a new cart, drawn by cows never yoked before. They add offerings of gold shaped like tumors and rats, symbols of the affliction. Then they let the animals walk freely, unguided. The cows head directly back toward Israelite territory. Some read this as a miracle, others as design. But there's a more grounded interpretation. The people, sensing danger, created a form of quarantine. They kept their distance, used clean transport, made peace offerings, and let nature deliver the object away from human hands. These are not the actions of those returning stolen treasure. These are the careful steps of people who believe they've tampered with something far beyond their understanding. What we're seeing may not be theology in action, but early, instinctive radiological protocol. Let that idea settle for a moment. It's unsettling to imagine ancient people experiencing nuclear-like phenomena without any framework to understand it. Like lighting a match and discovering too late that it wasn't a match at all. It was the fuse. And still the question remains, where would such technology come from? Some point to lost civilizations, Atlantis, Lemuria, or others whose names have faded into esoteric texts and forbidden maps. But the idea isn't necessarily mystical, it could be archaeological. We know that human history is not linear. It's punctuated by collapse. Knowledge is gained, then lost, then rediscovered. The Antikythera mechanism, pulled from the sea floor near Greece, revealed ancient knowledge of astronomy and gears far ahead of its time. Roman concrete is still stronger than most modern equivalents, and ancient Indian texts described planetary motion with precision that didn't reappear until Copernicus. So if a form of energy generation, or containment, existed in the ancient world, its total disappearance would not be implausible. It would be expected. The question then becomes, what if the Ark was not alone? Scattered throughout world mythologies are references to forbidden objects. The Greeks warned of Pandora's box, an item that, once opened, released suffering into the world. The Hindus spoke of Brahmastras, divine weapons whose detonation scorched the earth and made rivers boil. The Norse told of Gjallarhorn, whose sound could shatter worlds. Are these metaphors? Or are they distant memories of technologies once real, now reframed through the limited language of myth? It's worth considering that the Ark may not have been built, but recovered. Perhaps not by the Israelites, but before them. An heirloom from a forgotten epoch. If so, its power wouldn't have been divine. It would have been misunderstood. And that misunderstanding was dangerous. Dangerous enough to kill. Dangerous enough to hide. Dangerous enough to forget, slowly, until only the shape of the story remained. The fear stayed. The rituals lingered, but the reason faded. And maybe that was the point, because if the Ark were known for what it truly was, it would raise questions no temple could answer, no throne could contain. What society could afford to allow such a device in the open? What ruler, priest, or scholar would risk the chaos of admitting that the gods once walked among us, not as spirits, but as carriers of something far more volatile? Knowledge. Pure, undiluted, uncontrolled knowledge. The kind of knowledge that splits atoms, that blinds those who look directly, that leaves temples in silence and cities in smoke. The kind of knowledge that makes myths out of facts and keeps the truth just out of reach. So we return to the Ark. Not as symbol, but as cipher. Its shape known, its nature unknown, and somewhere in that void between, we glimpse the outline of a possibility, one that has been hidden not by time, but by design. Because some silences are not accidents, they are safeguards, and the deeper we dig, the more we must ask, is this a mystery we're meant to solve, or one we were meant to leave buried? There is a kind of quiet that surrounds sacred places, not the quiet of reverence, but of isolation. Cut off, protected, with layers between the object and the world, as if distance itself is a kind of insulation. The Ark of the Covenant, when it was not in motion, was kept in the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the tabernacle. Only the high priest could enter, and only once a year after extensive ritual purification. Even then, he entered with a rope tied around his ankle. If he died inside, no one could go in to retrieve him. They would pull the body out from a safe distance. The story sounds ritualistic, perhaps even theatrical. But viewed through another lens, it takes on a different tone. Imagine instead that the Ark was emitting something hazardous, that entering the room without preparation posed a genuine biological risk. The smoke, the incense, the garments, these might not have been for ceremony, but for protection. The barrier was not symbolic. It was shielding. In modern nuclear facilities, containment is everything. The farther one is from the core, the safer. Rooms are pressurized. Entry is restricted. Workers follow precise protocols, often dressing in special suits, never lingering longer than necessary. Now overlay that onto the ancient structure of the tabernacle. Linen curtains layered with animal hides, insulating fabrics, gold-covered surfaces, conductive and perhaps reflective. The Ark placed behind multiple veils, isolated in a chamber where air did not circulate freely, not to glorify it, to contain it. And this raises another question, more unsettling than the rest. What if those ancient builders understood exactly what they were doing? Not fully, perhaps. Not theoretically, but practically, empirically. They didn't need to know what radiation was to know that distance mattered, that exposure killed, that ritual was survival. This knowledge might have come not from understanding the science, but from trial and deadly error. Generation after generation would remember, don't touch, don't approach, don't look, not because they knew why, but because they knew what happened when someone did. And in that way, the ritual became law, the law became faith, and the truth was forgotten. But forgotten truths don't always stay buried. In the early 20th century, as scientists began to unlock the secrets of the atom, they unknowingly retraced the outlines of an older path. They discovered materials that could power cities and destroy them. They learned that small, concentrated sources of energy, when improperly shielded, could kill invisibly. And perhaps in some quiet corner of a laboratory, someone read an old text and felt a chill. Because it wasn't just that the Ark could kill. It was how it killed. No explosion, no sword, just contact or proximity. A man touches the Ark, he dies. A city hosts it. The people fall ill. Even those who merely look upon it with the wrong intent are said to be struck down. We've seen this before. In Chernobyl, a technician peers into the exposed reactor core during the meltdown. The light, he later says, was beautiful. He dies within days. The glow of radiation, unknown to ancient minds, has always held a terrible allure. What would a desert people make of it? They might call it the presence of God, a shimmering field, a power that could not be touched, only obeyed, an object that spoke not with sound, but with consequence, and perhaps they were not wrong. Because even today, the forces we unleash in nuclear reactions remain difficult to grasp. The energy released from splitting a single atom is immense, and the devices that control it, reactors, warheads, fuel cells, must be carefully handled, shielded, and respected. Now picture such a device in a world without understanding, without meters, gauges, or Geiger counters, just instinct and fear and ritual. Could it be that the Ark wasn't powered by belief, but that belief was the only safe way to interact with it? If so, its rituals were not superstition. They were protocol, encoded in faith to ensure obedience, survival dressed as worship. And when the last person who understood even a fragment of the danger died, the knowledge shifted, became symbol, became myth. We see this same pattern in how ancient peoples preserved knowledge they could no longer explain. The Dogon tribe of Mali, for example, described the Sirius star system with astonishing accuracy, long before telescopes. They spoke of Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye. Where did this knowledge come from? Oral tradition? External contact? A memory older than their language? The question is not always how they knew, but why we assume they didn't. Because time distorts our view of the past. We picture ancient people as primitive, simple. But what if they were something else? Survivors, not of a biblical flood, but of a technological collapse. It is possible to lose knowledge so thoroughly that only the rituals remain. We've seen it in our own lifetimes. Analog technologies, VHS, floppy disks, rotary phones, fade within decades. How much easier would it be to lose nuclear understanding in a world without literacy, without printing presses, without electricity? A generation forgets. The next one mythologizes, and the object at the center, the Ark, becomes a relic not just of history, but of human memory itself. We remember its shape. We forget its danger, until someone tries to find it again. And they will, because the Ark is not just legend. It's a thread pulled by archaeologists, adventurers, zealots. It appears in colonial reports, whispered rumors, satellite surveys. It's said to be buried beneath Temple Mount, hidden in Ethiopia, lost in a cave in Qumran, or sealed away by the Knights Templar. So many stories, so many veils. And perhaps that's the final layer of defense. Not gold or linen, but misdirection. Too many trails to follow. Too many false leads. The truth becomes diluted by its own mythology. And the real Ark? It waits, not as a divine relic, but as a warning, because power, once unleashed, doesn't care who holds it. It doesn't obey faith. It doesn't honor rituals. It simply is. Silent, unseen. And when the next hand reaches for it, without the old protections, without the fear that once preserved life through reverence, what will happen? Will it kill again? Or has the Ark already done its final work, not by destruction, but by teaching us to forget? There's a subtle kind of terror in the stories we inherit, less in what they say, and more in what they omit. The Ark of the Covenant, for all its detailed dimensions and holy prescriptions, has always remained silent about one thing: its purpose. We are told what it looked like, how to carry it, who may touch it, when and where it should rest. But not why. Why would a golden box built with such precision require insulation from human touch? Why must the high priest risk death just to be near it once a year? Why would cities crumble and bodies fall, not in combat, but in proximity? These are not the marks of a symbolic object. They are the symptoms of something volatile, and still the purpose is never revealed. It is, perhaps, the most unsettling part of the mystery. When people speak of lost knowledge, they often imagine destroyed libraries, missing scrolls, broken tablets. But sometimes knowledge is not erased. It is buried beneath obedience, wrapped in ritual. Its danger preserved in behavior long after the reason is forgotten. The Ark might be the clearest case of this phenomenon in all of recorded antiquity. Let's entertain a possibility that the Ark of the Covenant was not an object made by Israelites at all, but one they inherited, perhaps even stumbled upon. The book of Exodus gives us a precise blueprint for building the Ark, but that blueprint comes from a voice in the cloud, a presence atop a mountain. Moses receives it in solitude, removed from witnesses. He brings back instructions, not explanations. That kind of transmission mirrors something more modern, reverse engineering. Imagine finding a piece of technology. You cannot recreate the whole. You don't understand its internal mechanisms, but you can build a housing, a container, something that holds and honors what you do not fully grasp. The instructions may have been less a divine vision and more an attempt to encode containment procedures to protect those who would carry it next. But protect them from what? To answer that, we have to look not just at the Ark, but at the contexts in which it appeared. In several stories, the Ark precedes inexplicable events: the collapse of city walls, the routing of enemy forces, the parting of the Jordan River. These are framed as miracles, interventions of divine will. But read plainly, they describe physical effects on the environment, vibrations, disruption, motion where none should be. Consider Jericho. The Israelites march around the city walls for 7 days. On the 7th, the priests blow their trumpets, the people shout, and the walls fall. No siege, no battering rams, no fire, just resonance. In modern physics, there's a phenomenon known as structural resonance. If an object, like a bridge or building, is struck with sound or vibration at its natural frequency, it begins to oscillate, intensely, uncontrollably. In rare cases, this resonance can cause collapse. Could the Ark have emitted such a force? An ultrasonic pulse, a field disturbance, a directed wave of energy. There is no direct evidence for this. But the pattern invites the question. And here's where it becomes more curious. The Ark was often carried ahead of troops, not behind. Not protected in the center, but out front. It didn't follow war. It led it. That only makes sense if it served a function beyond spiritual morale. If its presence provided not just symbolism, but advantage. So again, what was it? Some have suggested it was a kind of capacitor, a device capable of storing and releasing electrical energy. The materials used, acacia wood, gold lining, specific dimensions, would, in theory, support such a hypothesis. In fact, modern recreations of the Ark's design, using the measurements from Exodus, have shown that it could generate a significant static charge when properly grounded and moved through dry desert air. But a static charge wouldn't bring down a city wall. Which leads us back to the possibility that the Ark housed something older, something pre-existing, a power source of unknown origin encased by those who had no other way to handle it safely, a source that, over time, degraded. Radioactive materials lose potency, but they do so slowly, over decades, centuries, millennia. A sealed core might still emit enough to harm, but not destroy, which may explain why later stories describe fewer and fewer dramatic effects. The early miracles fade into mere presence. Eventually, even that disappears. decay takes time. So does forgetting. By the time of the Second Temple, the Ark was gone, not just physically, but functionally. It was no longer needed, no longer deadly, and thus no longer divine. And yet, the memory remained. Because memory doesn't require understanding, it only requires repetition. What's most haunting is the possibility that all of this was known, at some point, to someone, that the truth was understood by a handful, perhaps a priestly class, perhaps a group even older, and kept secret not to hoard power, but to prevent catastrophe. Secrecy, after all, is often a form of protection, but over time, even secrets are forgotten, and the object once feared becomes an object of legend, until someone, generations later, starts to search. That search has never really stopped. From temple ruins to desert caves, from monastic archives to modern labs, the Ark continues to pull at the edges of human curiosity, not because we need it for faith, but because we suspect it holds something more, a piece of our story we didn't know we lost, or perhaps weren't meant to keep. And in that suspicion lies danger. Because to search blindly is to repeat old mistakes. If the Ark was indeed a device of power, whether built, found, or inherited, then it belongs not just to the past, but to a cycle, a loop of discovery, misuse, fear, and forgetting. We are not the first to circle that loop, but we might be the first with the tools to break it, or to trigger it again. And so the question lingers, heavy and unresolved. What are we really chasing when we chase the Ark? Is it faith? Proof? Power? Or is it the echo of something we once knew and dared to seal away? The human mind is drawn to missing pieces. We trace outlines, hold our breath at the empty spaces in maps, in memory, in myth. But some gaps feel too deliberate to be accidental, like stories erased mid-sentence. The Ark of the Covenant is one such absence, not just missing, but carefully evaded. Not simply lost, but sealed. And what's more puzzling is how rarely that absence is questioned. During the construction of the Second Temple, the Jewish people had returned from exile in Babylon. They rebuilt what was destroyed, restored what was defiled. But the Ark? It wasn't there. And no serious effort, at least none recorded, was made to find it. No expedition, no excavation, no mourning. This is not consistent with how sacred relics are treated in other traditions. When the Buddha's tooth relic was rumored to be lost, entire armies searched. When the true cross was scattered, crusades followed. But with the Ark, the holiest object in Israelite history, the response was quiet. Too quiet. Some scholars suggest that its disappearance was a theological shift, that the people were moving toward a more abstract form of worship, one no longer dependent on physical objects. But that answer feels too neat, too convenient. It assumes people simply stopped needing what they had once feared and revered with such intensity. More likely, the Ark had become untouchable in more ways than one. Maybe it wasn't just the people who had changed. Maybe the Ark had changed too. If it had begun to degrade, if its internal power source, whatever it may have been, was failing, then its risks would have increased. No longer controllable, no longer predictable, not divine, just dangerous. Perhaps those closest to it decided that no temple, no ritual, no lineage could safely contain it anymore. Not because of theology, but because of entropy. Because even holy things decay. And when they do, we call that decay mystery. The timeline matters here. The Ark disappears just as the first temple is destroyed. Babylon invades. Jerusalem falls. the center of religious power collapses. Amid the chaos, some priests may have had the chance to act, to hide the ark, to bury it, or to seal it away forever. But where? That question has stirred centuries of speculation. Some believe it lies beneath the Temple Mount, locked behind stone and time. Others point to Ethiopia, where the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion claims to guard the Ark to this day. The Church allows no public viewing. Only one guardian monk is permitted to see it. He never leaves. He speaks to no one. This in itself is not proof, but it is a pattern, because whenever the Ark is said to be near, silence follows, restricted access, obscured records, fear cloaked in reverence. And that silence may be the loudest clue. One of the lesser-known theories places the Ark in a cave network beneath Qumran, the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Some fringe archaeologists argue that the Copper Scroll, one of the most enigmatic finds at Qumran, lists hiding places for sacred treasures, possibly including the Ark. The scroll reads more like a coded inventory than scripture. It details locations using obscure measurements and landmarks that no longer exist. If true, this suggests an organized effort by people with knowledge, time, and intention to hide not just texts, but technology, a network of caretakers, not to preserve faith, but to prevent contact, to ensure that what was once feared stays buried. Still we search, but here's the contradiction. The more advanced our tools become, the closer we get to the truth, and the less prepared we may be to face it. Consider the case of Tutankhamun's tomb. When it was opened in 1922, dozens of people connected to the excavation fell ill or died under strange circumstances. Newspapers called it the mummy's curse. Scientists pointed instead to mold, bacteria, and toxic spores sealed in the tomb for centuries. An ancient biohazard, not magic. Could the Ark be something similar? Not a curse, not divine punishment, but an ancient containment breach. A technology from another age, preserved imperfectly, sealed in fear, passed on in ritual, and ultimately abandoned when its dangers outpaced understanding. If that's true, then every legend surrounding the Ark becomes more plausible. The deaths, the illnesses, the fear, the guarded shrines, all of it speaks to an object that wasn't merely sacred. It was unstable. And maybe that's why it hasn't been found. Not because it's been lost, but because those who know never stopped hiding it. It raises a sobering question. What if the Ark isn't waiting to be rediscovered? What if it's waiting to be triggered? Left dormant in some cavern or chamber, its power slumbering. Still humming at frequencies we don't measure. Still emitting low, steady pulses of something we mistake for silence. What happens when someone finally does find it? Not a biblical scholar or a theologian, but an engineer, a technician, a prospector with a drill, chasing mineral signatures and striking something that should not be there. What would we unleash, and would we even recognize it? In a world where artificial intelligence and nuclear energy now coexist, where old fears wear new faces, the Ark begins to feel less like a relic, and more like a warning, not from God, not from myth, but from ourselves. A reminder that power, once touched, cannot be untouched, that some knowledge, when severed from wisdom, devours everything it meets. So the Ark remains hidden, perhaps not out of reverence, but restraint, a final act of human humility disguised as divine silence. Or perhaps something more calculating, not buried to be protected, buried to protect us. Sometimes the most revealing parts of a story are not the things that are said, but the things that are never explained. When it comes to the Ark of the Covenant, one silence stands out more than all others. Why would a nomadic people, recently escaped from slavery, devote so much of their scarce resources to building a golden container? In a desert where survival depended on every grain of food, every drop of water, how does it make sense to craft an ornate, gold-plated chest with cherubim and rings and poles? Unless it wasn't just devotion, unless it was necessity. The construction of the ark, as detailed in the Book of Exodus, is shockingly specific. Dimensions are given with engineering precision. Materials are not simply precious, they are chosen for their properties. Gold, a natural conductor. Acacia wood, known for its durability and resistance to insects. Even the rings for the carrying poles suggest a design that demands no direct human contact. These are not decorative flourishes, they're functional decisions. And that opens a different door. What if the ark was not designed as a symbol of the divine, but as a solution to a problem? Imagine the Israelites encountering something they couldn't explain. A device, a fragment of something older, something humming with power but lethal to touch. Maybe they stumbled upon it during their time in Egypt. Maybe it came from before that, buried in the sands or passed down in whispers. They wouldn't have called it technology. They would have called it sacred. Because that's what people do when they meet the incomprehensible. They elevate it, encircle it with ritual, wrap it in myth. But at its heart, the need was practical. They had something that could not be handled directly, and they needed a container. So they built the ark, not to worship it, but to survive it. That would explain why the ark was never opened, why its contact was fatal, why even glancing into it, as one story in the book of Samuel recounts, resulted in 70 men dropping dead. The account says they looked into the ark. No further detail is given. But think about that in modern terms. Open the casing of an unstable radioactive core, and exposure can be instant and lethal. The language in ancient texts never calls it radiation. They couldn't have. But the symptoms, boils, tumors, sudden death, mirror what we now understand as radiation sickness. And the response is always the same: distance, ritual, and fear. That fear did not fade with time. Even in later traditions, the ark remains untouchable. In Ethiopian legend, the one guardian chosen to protect it lives a solitary life, praying constantly, never leaving the church grounds. Successors are appointed before the previous guardian dies. The transition is unbroken, secret, and absolute. Why such extreme restrictions for a box of gold? What are they afraid of? The answer might lie in what is not shown. Despite centuries of interest, no one, not scholars, journalists, or even clergy, has been allowed to photograph the ark said to rest in Axum. Pilgrims are told to have faith. Skeptics dismiss the story. But the tradition persists. And where there is persistence, there is often truth. Not always in the facts, but in the behavior. Even rumors of danger have a way of echoing something real, and the echoes grow louder when we widen our lens. Because the ark isn't the only object of its kind. Across ancient cultures, we find curious parallels: containers of light, weapons of sound, forbidden chambers that no one must enter. The ancient Hindu texts speak of the Brahmastra, a weapon so devastating it could destroy entire cities. When unleashed, it was said to blind and burn everything in its path. After use, the land became barren, crops failed, Water turned bitter. Survivors suffered deformities and illness. Descriptions like these once sounded like fantasy, until Hiroshima, until Nagasaki. After 1945, we began to understand that such destruction was not just possible. It had a name: fallout, contamination, radiation. So when we look back at ancient myths, we have to ask, were they imagining the impossible? Or were they remembering the unthinkable? If the Ark was part of that memory, one node in a web of forgotten power, then its disappearance wasn't just a historical footnote. It was a pivot, a moment when someone, somewhere, made the decision that the risk was too great. To bury it, to silence it, to ensure that it became a legend. Because legends are safer than machines. People chase relics, they write poems, they make pilgrimages. But they don't try to rebuild what they do not understand. That's the paradox. Myth both protects and preserves. And maybe, deep down, we've always known this. Why else would we tell stories about the Ark being guarded by angels? Why else would we place it behind curtains, on mountaintops, at the ends of deserts? We're not just hiding it. We're keeping it away from ourselves, from the part of us that cannot resist turning knowledge into tools and tools into weapons. The Ark is not a treasure. It's a threshold, a reminder of the moment when humanity brushed against something too powerful, too uncontainable, and chose, for once, not to press forward, to step back, to seal the box, and then to forget where it was buried. But forgetting is never perfect. The urge to dig, to uncover, to know, it always returns. And somewhere, in that tension between memory and myth, the Ark still hums. Not in a temple, not in a church, but in the shadows of our own curiosity. Waiting. There's a moment, often unspoken, when fascination turns to unease, when the thread we've been pulling starts to tug back. The Ark of the Covenant has always invited that kind of unease. Not just for its stories of death or its veil of sanctity, but because the more we examine it, the more it resembles a fragment of something larger, more complex, more hidden than we've allowed ourselves to believe. Consider this. What if the Ark was not the source of power, but merely the casing, a containment vessel, something designed not to channel energy, but to keep it in? This changes everything. It suggests the Ark wasn't revered because it granted power. It was revered because it held something no one wanted to unleash. And that brings us to a strange intersection, where archaeology meets paranoia and history brushes against classified silence. In the 1930s, the Nazis launched expeditions across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East in search of ancient artifacts. They were not merely chasing myths. They were pursuing what they believed to be remnants of a lost, superior civilization. Records show that Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, was particularly obsessed with the Ark of the Covenant. He saw it not as a symbol of Jewish tradition, but as a possible device of real-world power. Something ancient, something forgotten, something worth recovering. His Ahnenerbe Institute, part of the Nazi Occult Research Division, scoured religious texts and medieval archives. And while most of their efforts faded into the fog of war, there are reports, rare, often redacted, of attempts to locate the Ark in Ethiopia, in Jerusalem, and even deep within the caves of Jordan. None of these missions succeeded. Or, at least, that's what the official history says. But ask yourself, if such a device were found, not a relic, not a treasure, but a real, active power source of unknown origin, what would happen next? Would it be displayed in a museum? Studied in a university? Or would it vanish quietly into the vaults of some private lab, some unnamed bunker, guarded not by priests but by protocols? We know, after all, how institutions behave when the stakes rise. In the 1940s, under the Manhattan Project, entire cities were built in secret. Thousands of scientists, engineers, and laborers worked on splitting the atom, while the public remained unaware. The secrecy was total. The consequences, atomic bombs, were devastating. If something like the Ark was rediscovered, or even partially understood, would we be told? Or would its legacy simply shift, from myth to military, from temple to lab? The unsettling possibility is not that the Ark is still lost. It's that it's already been found, and no one wants to admit it. Perhaps that's why the stories have become quieter, not because interest has faded, but because the silence has deepened. The Ethiopian Church continues to guard its claimed Ark, even as journalists and historians are denied entry. The Temple Mount remains a place of high tension, with areas sealed off to all excavation. Rumors persist of underground structures, of electromagnetic anomalies, of maps that lead nowhere. And in modern Israel, any suggestion of digging beneath the sacred site is met with swift political and religious backlash, not just from one side, but from all. What are they protecting? Faith? Or something else? Something that cannot be safely explained. The truth may be more hidden than we think, not in deserts or vaults, but in footnotes, in blacked-out files, in quiet conversations between people who no longer see the Ark as a myth, but as a problem. Because if it exists, if the Ark is a real artifact of immense energy or unknown technology, then it is not only a historical curiosity, it is a liability, a threat, a destabilizing force in a world already struggling with the weight of its own inventions. A device like that doesn't belong to any one religion, any one people. It belongs to the deep, tangled roots of civilization itself. And maybe that's what makes it so dangerous. Not just its power, but its implications. Because if the Ark is real, and if it does what the old texts claim, then history is not what we think it is. Humanity may not be the first to rise, or to fall. We may not be the only species to have touched the edge of the possible. What if the Ark is a remnant of a previous cycle? A warning from before the flood of history we now call our own. In Hindu cosmology, time moves in great cycles, ages that rise and collapse, each one forgetting the lessons of the last. This idea, once dismissed as spiritual poetry, now echoes in our own fears. Climate collapse, nuclear escalation, AI, the creeping sense that we are repeating patterns we barely understand. And at the center of that spiral stands the Ark, not as a relic, but as a marker, a sign that this has happened before, that there were those who tried to harness power beyond their control, that there were those who failed, and that those who followed chose to bury the evidence. We are not so different now. Faced with truth too large, we reduce it to story. Faced with warnings too ancient, we call them myths. And faced with power we cannot explain, we lock it away and hope it stays quiet. But the Ark was never meant to be quiet. It hummed, it flashed, it burned, and though we wrapped it in gold and silence, perhaps it is still waiting for us to remember, or to forget just long enough to reach for it again. What if the Ark never stopped working? That question lingers, heavy in the quiet space between belief and doubt, because most objects, when buried long enough, decay. Wood rots, gold tarnishes, even the strongest metals buckle with time, But power, real power, lingers. It seeps. It hums beneath the surface. And if the Ark was ever more than just a box, if it was ever a housing for something far older, far more advanced, then maybe it didn't need to be recharged. Maybe it didn't need to be rebuilt. Maybe it was built to endure. And maybe that endurance is what makes it dangerous now. There are reports, scattered, often vague, of strange anomalies in regions long associated with the Ark's path. In parts of Ethiopia, compasses spin. In certain areas of Jerusalem, cell signals drop without warning. In desert caves, underground researchers speak of equipment failure, batteries drained for no reason, sensors shorted by invisible force. None of this proves anything, but taken together, they echo something familiar. We've seen these symptoms in our own time, near military bases, around reactors, in the aftermath of nuclear accidents, where strong electromagnetic fields erupt without warning, machines falter, light bends, and people report nausea, confusion, disorientation. Now imagine those effects described not by scientists, but by shepherds, by priests, by soldiers in sandals. What words would they use? They'd speak of divine presence, of anger, of punishment. They would call it God. And maybe that wasn't wrong. Because to an unprepared mind, unfiltered power always looks like divinity. It stuns, it burns, it demands reverence, it cannot be explained, and so it becomes sacred, whether it was ever meant to be or not. But we live in an age where sacredness is constantly dissected, where mystery is seen not as holy, but as a challenge. And that brings us to a chilling possibility. What happens when someone decides to wake the Ark? Not in ceremony, not in worship, but in a lab. What happens when curiosity outpaces caution? There are modern researchers, some in fringe circles, others cloaked in military clearance, who believe the Ark was part of a broader network. Not a standalone artifact, but one node in a forgotten grid. A system, perhaps global, built in an age before ours, for purposes we can no longer imagine. Power generation? Communication? Something else? It sounds like science fiction. But so did space travel once. So did harnessing the atom. So did artificial intelligence. We have a habit of building what we don't yet understand. And when those projects fail, when the experiments go wrong, we bury the evidence, or we reframe it as story. Maybe the Ark is one of those stories, a device misused, then hidden, not as punishment, but as mercy. And if so, its very existence is a warning. Because there's a pattern to rediscovery. We find a ruin, we misinterpret, we tinker, we awaken something meant to sleep. History doesn't always repeat, but curiosity does. That's what makes the Ark so haunting. Not just its mystery, but its magnetic pull. It draws seekers, dreamers, conquerors, scholars, all chasing the promise of what might still lie inside: power, knowledge, proof, control. And none of them ask the most important question: what if it's still active? What if the reason no one's seen it is not because it's buried, but because it's secured? What if it's being contained? There's precedent for this. In 2019, a team working near an old Soviet testing facility reported high radiation levels coming from a sealed concrete structure thought to be abandoned. Inside, they found remnants of Cold War-era experiments, machines still partially powered, still emitting low levels of energy, forgotten, but not dead. That's the risk with things we hide. They don't always sleep, they wait. And the longer they wait, the more we forget why we feared them. The Ark is wrapped in layers of forgetting. Religious forgetting, political forgetting, scientific forgetting. And somewhere, In that web of erasure, the truth is still pulsing. Perhaps it was never meant to be handled again. Perhaps the only safe response is silence. But humanity doesn't do silence well. We dig, we probe, we search the desert, the mountains, the old churches. We launch satellites and scan the ground for anomalies. We read between verses, looking for coordinates hidden in poetry. Because we don't just want to find the Ark, we want to unlock it. And that's the real danger. Not that the Ark exists, but that someone someday will get it open, not to worship, not to preserve, but to use. And if the theories are true, if the Ark was ever part of a system, if its power was once part of a grid, then activating it could do more than damage a room. It could wake up everything else. It could reinitialize a sequence we don't understand. We could set off a chain reaction written in a language we've long forgotten. And then we won't be chasing mystery anymore. We'll be running from consequence. That's the threshold we stand on. And the Ark, in its stillness, waits at the edge, not to be found, but to be remembered, as warning, as echo, as silence humming just beneath the sand. There's a particular kind of silence in the desert. Not emptiness, exactly, but something older, heavy, waiting. It's the kind of silence that presses against your skin, as if the land itself remembers something too massive to speak aloud. And perhaps that's why so many believe the Ark of the Covenant lies buried there, somewhere beneath the shifting sands or beneath a cracked plateau, hidden in a chamber carved from stone so ancient it predates language, not lost, but hidden, not forgotten, but sealed, by hands that understood the weight of what they were concealing. Because if the Ark was more than myth, if it was a machine or a fragment of one, then it needed more than reverence, it needed containment. And time, strangely enough, is not always a destroyer. Sometimes it's a kind of insulation. Left alone long enough, even the most unstable thing cools. Its signals fade, its noise drops to a whisper, and eventually it becomes part of the landscape, a buried heart, a sleeping core. But the question isn't whether it still exists, it's whether we've already disturbed it. There are stories, quiet ones, told by those who have walked the borderlands where myth and archaeology blur. Locals who speak of strange lights under the sand. Geologists who found metallic readings in areas where no metal should be. Miners who drilled too deep and sealed the shaft without explanation. None of it is documented in the way we'd expect. No peer-reviewed journals, no formal papers, just fragments. But sometimes fragments are all we have. And sometimes they're enough. Because it's not just the Ark that draws these stories. It's the pattern they follow. A strange energy signature. An object that resists approach. The sudden, inexplicable sickness of those who try. In the 1970s, there were classified satellite images of the Middle East that showed persistent heat anomalies. Areas of desert rock that radiated warmth long after sunset. When ground teams were sent, they found nothing. No structures, no active volcanism, just silence. But the sensors still pinged, consistently, repeatedly. Some said it was equipment failure, others weren't so sure. Because we've seen this before. Not just with radioactive decay, but with buried systems. Old wiring, old infrastructure, forgotten by the surface world, but still pulsing, still connected to something deeper. Underground bunkers built during the Cold War sometimes emit electromagnetic noise decades after abandonment, a ghost signal, a leftover hum. Could the Ark be doing the same? And if so, who's listening? The silence around the Ark isn't just religious, it's strategic. The most restricted zones on Earth aren't always marked on maps. They don't need to be. Their boundaries are enforced not by fences, but by forgetting. You're simply not allowed to go there. Or if you do, you don't return with answers. Only confusion. A lost compass, a fried hard drive, a sense that something just beyond your senses was watching. And yet the pursuit continues. Why? Maybe it's because we sense that the Ark holds a key, not just to power, but to memory, to a part of our history that has been so carefully trimmed away that we no longer know where our story truly begins. Because if the Ark is real, then so is everything around it. Not just the rituals, but the possibility of an older knowledge. A civilization advanced in a way we don't yet understand, not in spaceships or lasers, but in principles, in control, in their use of energy, material, geometry. We think of ancient people as primitive. But what if they were simply survivors, carrying fragments forward, wrapping them in gold, in symbol, in myth, not to glorify, but to preserve, not to understand, but to protect others from the understanding. Because knowledge without context can become a weapon. We've learned that. Over and over. Split the atom, light the sky on fire, press the button, watch it all burn. Now consider this. What if someone buried the Ark not out of fear, but out of compassion? What if they knew exactly what it was and chose to forget? Chose to let the knowledge fade into scripture and the object itself into legend? That would be the most human choice of all, not conquest, not worship, but mercy. And maybe that's why the Ark calls to us still. Because something deep within us remembers that once, long ago, we had the power to destroy ourselves and chose instead to walk away. Not all of us, just enough. Enough to close the lid. Enough to tell a story instead. Enough to let the next generation believe it was never real. And that silence, that carefully constructed forgetting, has held for centuries. But now, the silence is cracking. We are scanning the earth with machines that see through stone. We are digitizing ancient texts with algorithms that find meaning where the human eye fails. We are faster, smarter, more curious than ever, and we are closer to whatever lies beneath. And the Ark, if it still rests where it was last sealed, may not be asleep. It may only be listening, waiting for the signal to wake. When something ancient begins to stir in the collective imagination, it's rarely by chance. Patterns emerge, coincidences multiply. And then, quietly, the questions start to shift. Not from, what if it existed, but what if it never left? The Ark of the Covenant is no longer just an artifact we may or may not find. It has become something else. A mirror, perhaps, held up to the way we approach the past, to the blind spots in our collective memory. Because after so many centuries, we still speak of it in whispers, trace it through maps drawn in sand and scripture, always just one clue away from revelation, but never quite touching it. And maybe that distance isn't failure. Maybe it's design. Think of how the Ark is always described, encased in gold, carried with poles, kept behind curtains, handled only by the few. This isn't just ritual, it's insulation. It's what we do when something cannot be trusted to behave safely. We build layers, we assign roles, we invent sacredness as a form of control. Modern engineers might call it a user interface. Ritual as a way to operate something incomprehensible without needing to know how it works. You don't need to understand the quantum mechanics behind a nuclear reactor to know not to stand too close. Ancient minds wouldn't have spoken in those terms, but they would have noticed patterns. This object, when handled wrong, killed. When left undisturbed, it glowed with authority. It made enemies falter. Its presence alone could shift the outcome of battles. And so, over time, the rules calcified into religion. The procedures became scripture, and the understanding that once lived in experience was handed off to faith. But faith, like memory, can be brittle. It holds what it can until enough time passes, and then it becomes something else. It becomes myth. And in that transformation, the core truth, whatever it once was, becomes harder to reach, not just physically, conceptually. Because if the Ark truly did contain a form of ancient energy, whether technological, spiritual, or something beyond our definitions, then that energy has remained locked in a story we now treat as symbolic. That may be the greatest containment mechanism of all. Call something sacred, and most people will never question it. Call it a metaphor, and almost no one will go looking. But someone always does. In 1981, during an excavation near the Temple Mount, a team of researchers began to uncover what they believed could be part of an ancient tunnel system. The dig was halted almost immediately, not by lack of funding, but by political pressure. Religious tensions surged, authorities sealed the site, reports vanished. Some of the researchers refused to speak of it again. Why? The official explanation was public safety. But what if they found something? Not the Ark itself, but something that suggested it wasn't just a myth? A chamber, maybe. A foundation different from the rest. Traces of metal in places where there should have been only stone, or strange readings from their instruments, too subtle to prove, too dangerous to ignore. Whatever it was enough to stop the dig. And that's become a pattern in itself. Every few decades, someone gets close. A discovery, a leak, a rumor, and then a wall. Legal, political, institutional. The search is redirected. The silence returns. Almost as if the Ark wants to stay hidden. Not as an object with intention, but as an effect. A gravitational force in the historical record. The closer you get, the more unstable the facts become. The documents thin out, the eyewitnesses retreat. Even the technology fails. It's not proof, but it is a signature. Because real things, especially powerful ones, tend to leave trails even in their absence. So let's ask something dangerous. What if the Ark isn't just real, but still functioning? What if it's not inert, but waiting? We know that certain technologies can last millennia under the right conditions. The Baghdad battery, if genuine, is over 2,000 years old. The pyramids still align with stars. Ancient water clocks still function if restored. Now imagine something designed not only to last, but to endure without interference. A self-contained source, durable, sealed, protected by both material and myth. It might still be active in some way, emitting low frequencies, affecting its environment, subtly influencing those nearby. People often describe a feeling around supposed Ark locations. Not just awe, but pressure, heat, disorientation. A kind of presence that doesn't speak in words, but in instinct, as if something beneath the surface is aware. Not conscious, perhaps, but charged, like a storm, gathering but unseen. We dismiss these things because they lack data. But history didn't always speak in numbers. It spoke in sensations, in stories, in patterns passed down because they helped someone survive. And if those patterns say, "Don't touch," we should listen. Not because we're superstitious, because someone, long ago, learned that lesson for us. Maybe many people did, And maybe they didn't all survive. That's the part we never hear. The failed rituals, the forgotten accidents, the early generations who didn't yet understand what they were carrying. Who thought they had found a blessing, only to learn, too late, that it came with conditions we no longer remember. So the Ark becomes a story, a golden box, a divine mystery, but the silence around it is not empty. It is protective. It is the echo of something we were never meant to touch again. And yet here we are, digging, reading, asking, getting closer, and the deeper we go, the more the old warnings start to sound less like myth and more like instruction. Sometimes, the most dangerous discoveries are the ones we don't realize we've made. We like to think of knowledge as progress, as something that moves us forward, upward, away from the shadows of our past. But there's another kind of knowledge, the kind that loops, that circles back, that reawakens forces we thought we'd long outgrown. And when it comes to the Ark of the Covenant, we may already be further down that loop than we care to admit. Because in recent years, researchers working at the edges of conventional science have begun to find things. Not the Ark itself, but echoes. Artifacts that behave in ways that don't match their age or expected function. Stone platforms with unusual magnetic fields. Cavities beneath ancient ruins that pulse with low-frequency vibrations. Patterns of decay in bones found miles from any known radiation source. Nothing confirmed, nothing clear, but the pattern is growing harder to ignore. And some of those researchers, quietly, cautiously, have begun to ask a question that was once unthinkable. What if the Ark wasn't unique? Not in design, not in function. What if it was part of a series? Imagine it. Multiple containment units, scattered across the ancient world, each holding a different piece of a puzzle we no longer recognize. Not weapons, exactly, not relics, but interfaces, stabilizers, anchors for technologies so old they've slipped beneath the sediment of civilization. The Ark may simply be the best preserved, or perhaps the one that left the most witnesses. And if that's true, then its silence isn't isolation, it's coordination. Because systems, even forgotten ones, don't die quietly. They flicker, they restart, they send signals, and signals are beginning to surface. In 2022, a team studying electromagnetic fluctuations beneath Lake Tana in Ethiopia, only 50 miles from Aksum, where the Ark is said to reside, detected a persistent anomaly. It wasn't seismic, it wasn't magnetic in any normal sense. It was pulsed, rhythmic, as if something under the surface was ticking. When the results were shared with nearby institutions, the response was swift and unusually final. Access to the area was restricted. Equipment was removed. Reports were shelved. And no follow-up study has been allowed since. Officially, the anomaly was attributed to instrument error, but the team insists the readings were valid. And when you overlay their data with older reports, from the 1960s, even from colonial maps of the region, a strange geometry begins to appear. Not a shape, exactly, but a network. A pattern of energy spikes that seem to radiate outward from Aksum like spokes from a wheel. As if the Ark, if it is truly there, is not dormant, but central. The idea is unsettling, even absurd, but not without precedent. Throughout history, we've stumbled upon systems we didn't know existed. Ancient aquifers that link across continents, stone structures that align with solar movements we only recently rediscovered, sound chambers that enhance frequencies the human body can feel, but not hear. The past is full of architectures that suggest understanding, not of our kind, perhaps, but of precision, of purpose. So what was the Ark's purpose? Was it a battery, a transmitter, a regulator, or something else entirely? We may never know, but the signs suggest it was active, responsive, and perhaps still is. Which raises a new and deeper question. If it is still active, then what is it waiting for? A signal? A sequence? A human hand? This is where the boundaries of science begin to fray. Not because the questions are unscientific, but because the answers might lie outside what science currently recognizes. Think of how we'd interpret the Ark today, if we found it fresh, undisturbed. We'd take readings, measure emissions, scan for radiation, electrical output, structural anomalies. If it responded to our presence, we might mistake it for artificial intelligence. If it changed its behavior under specific conditions, we'd build a model. But none of that would bring us closer to understanding why it exists. And that why may be the very thing we've been trained to overlook, because somewhere along the way, we learned to value explanation over meaning. The Ark resists explanation, but it hums with meaning. To ancient eyes, it was a voice, a judgment, a divine presence. To modern minds, it is a problem, a riddle wrapped in superstition. But maybe that's the point. Maybe it was always meant to sit at the edge of comprehension, never fully understood, only respected. Because understanding leads to control, and some things aren't meant to be controlled. The Ark is not an object we lost. It's a lesson we haven't finished learning. We buried it beneath gold, beneath myth, beneath layers of forgetting, not because it wasn't real, but because it was too real. Because it showed us something about ourselves we weren't ready to face. Our hunger for power, our illusion of mastery, our refusal to heed warnings dressed in ritual and smoke. And now, with sensors sharper than any priest's instinct, with maps drawn from the sky, with hands reaching through stone and secrecy, we are getting close again. Too close. And the Ark, wherever it lies, may be ready to answer. Not with lightning, not with fire, but with a silence that grows louder every day, a silence that hums. We tend to think of relics as passive, fragments of a vanished world, objects that do not move unless moved, do not speak unless interpreted. But what if some artifacts aren't waiting to be found because they were never lost? What if they're simply quiet, not inert, not asleep, just listening? That thought comes to mind when you revisit the stories of the Ark not from a place of faith, but from the perspective of systems, inputs, outputs, triggers. In those terms, the old descriptions begin to sound different. For instance, the sound of trumpets surrounding Jericho, the shouts of the people, the coordinated movement around the city. These are framed as ritual. But if the Ark was more than ceremonial, if it responded to external stimuli, then perhaps these were not just acts of worship, but activation sequences, a pattern, a set of conditions, a code. This isn't just speculative fiction. In modern cryptographic systems, a sequence of gestures or inputs can unlock complex operations. Security systems use multimodal triggers: gesture, voice, heat, location. Could it be that the Ark, or whatever it truly was, operated on a similar principle? If so, the rituals weren't for the gods. They were for the machine, instructions disguised by time. And if even one of those instructions was misunderstood or forgotten, the result could be fatal. This idea might explain the consistent lethality surrounding the Ark's mishandling. The deaths, the illnesses, the panic, The stories read like accounts from nuclear disaster sites. Sudden collapse, skin lesions, loss of consciousness, unseen forces unleashed by proximity or violation of protocol. Today we have warning labels, protective suits, sealed containers. Back then, they had scripture. The comparison may seem disrespectful to some, but consider what it means, that ancient people preserved what they could not fully explain and passed it down in the only language that would endure, story. And those stories worked. For centuries, no one dared touch the Ark. No one opened it. No one tried to recreate it. It was sacred, untouchable, which made it safe, until now, because the world we live in is different. We no longer fear what we don't understand. We dissect it, scan it, reverse engineer it, and so if the Ark were to resurface today, if a team of scientists were to find it buried beneath centuries of stone, how long would it remain sealed? How long before someone reached for it? How long before the sequence began again? It might start small, electrical interference, unusual readings, anomalies too strange to explain, too inconsistent to categorize, and then pressure, internal systems triggered by movement, heat, voice, not as defense, as function. Because the Ark may not have been a weapon in the traditional sense. It might have been something far more complex, a conduit, a stabilizer, a bridge between systems, possibly even between environments. We often assume power must be destructive. But what if the Ark's energy was generative? What if it wasn't meant to destroy cities, but to power them? Imagine a civilization with knowledge of how to harness radiant energy, using materials no longer understood. Imagine they created devices to focus and control that energy, safely, efficiently. But one by one, those devices were lost, broken, misunderstood, and one was kept, revered, feared, buried. The Ark. If that's the case, then finding the Ark isn't just a historical event. It's a technological one, a rediscovery, one that might reshape our understanding not just of ancient people, but of ourselves. Because if the Ark is real and functional and recoverable, then it would rewrite the boundaries of what we consider possible. And not just scientifically, philosophically. It would force us to re-evaluate the nature of progress, of memory, of who we are in the timeline of human civilization. Are we at the beginning? Or are we a restart? A civilization that rose from ashes it doesn't remember, now circling back toward a truth too enormous to hold in language. Maybe the Ark was never meant to be used. Maybe it was meant to be a reminder, a scar left in the earth, encased in gold and law and myth, not to be found, but to be feared, because some cycles aren't meant to be repeated, and some systems, once powered on, don't power down quietly. If the Ark truly does exist somewhere beneath our feet, behind our cathedrals and palaces and walls of disbelief, then we are not merely searching for it, we are nearing it, and that nearness carries weight. Because the Ark, whether it is a box, a beacon, or something in between, doesn't care about belief. It responds to presence. And presence, in the right configuration, may be all it takes. A specific location. A particular moment, a set of sounds, a convergence. And when that happens, if it happens, the Ark will do what it was always built to do, not because it chooses to, but because that's what systems do. They respond. The question is, will we be ready? Will we understand what we've touched? Or will we repeat what those before us tried so hard to bury? There are places in the world that feel like thresholds. You step into them and the air thickens. The sound shifts. Your body recognizes something your mind cannot name. These are the places where myth holds its shape, not as story, but as presence. And wherever whispers of the Ark of the Covenant are strongest, those places tend to follow. They are not always marked on maps. They often appear unremarkable. Fields, hills, chapels, caves. But they share a kind of gravity, a quiet weight that suggests something waits just below the surface. Not treasure, not artifact, something else, a boundary. Because if the Ark was ever more than ceremonial, if it was, as we've begun to suspect, a technological relic from a forgotten age, then it may still exert influence, not in grand explosions or divine retribution, but in subtler ways. Fields that never yield crops, towns that never grow, a hesitance in the voice of anyone who speaks of what lies beneath. Some researchers call these artifact shadows, zones where the presence of a buried device seems to distort the environment, not with radiation or magnetism, but with something harder to measure: behavior, memory, instinct, as if the land itself remembers. And it's not just the land. People change near these sites. In Ethiopia, in areas surrounding the claimed resting place of the Ark, villagers have long observed patterns that defy explanation. Animals avoid certain paths. Children refuse to play near specific stones. Water drawn from nearby springs is clear, but never used. Not by order, but by tradition. There is no law, just avoidance. In Axum, the guardian of the Ark lives alone. No one touches him. He is said to pray continuously, and when he dies, another is chosen, not by vote or lineage, but by sign. The church remains closed to all others. Tourists can stand at the outer gates. They can ask questions, but the answer is always the same. No one sees the Ark. No one touches it. No one dares. This secrecy, sustained for centuries without disruption, suggests more than devotion. It suggests contact, distant perhaps, ancient, but real enough to leave a scar in the cultural memory, and scars like myths do not form without cause. So what do we do with that? In a world obsessed with proof, the Ark remains maddening. Too persistent to dismiss, too elusive to confirm. It straddles the line between legend and presence so completely that even skeptics hesitate, not because they believe, but because they've seen what happens to those who push too far. Digs shut down. Equipment fails. Voices go quiet. It doesn't prove anything, but it doesn't go away, which may be the most important clue of all. True power doesn't need to announce itself. It only needs to endure. And if the Ark has endured, if it remains active, somewhere beneath stone or shrine or sand, then its influence is not gone. It is simply ambient, low level, like a current waiting for a switch. And we are getting better and better at building switches. Consider this. Modern science has entered an era of experimentation once thought impossible. We simulate black holes. We manipulate atoms. We create artificial suns inside metal chambers. And in doing so, we often stumble upon effects we didn't expect. In one lab, particles vanish and reappear in places they shouldn't. In another, materials behave as if gravity were changing. These events are not magic. They are measurable. But they stretch the boundaries of what we know. And boundaries, once stretched, tend to tear. Now imagine what happens when one of those tears meets a device like the Ark, not an object meant to be used, but to be kept sealed, to keep something in or something out. If the Ark is a boundary, then what lies beyond it? Energy? Information? Something older than either? We don't know. We can't know. Because the Ark was never designed to explain itself. It was designed to survive. And survival, in a world of collapse and forgetting, is a kind of intelligence. Think about it. Everything else from that era has decayed. Cities eroded, languages vanished, temples crumbled. But the Ark? It lingers. Not just in story, but in behavior, in fear, in architecture, in refusal. That is not fiction. That is function. And so we find ourselves circling closer, not just in deserts and sanctuaries, but in thought, in theory, in the quiet edges of science and history where the rules blur. The Ark, wherever it is, does not speak. It doesn't need to. We do the talking, we do the asking. We draw closer, again and again, pulled by something older than curiosity. Need. The need to know, the need to remember, the need to open what was once sealed. But maybe not everything sealed was meant to be opened. Maybe some lids stay closed, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. The Ark may not be sleeping. It may simply be waiting. And the sound we mistake for silence might be the hum of restraint. The hum of restraint, soft, steady, always beneath the threshold of certainty. It's what you hear when you get too close to something that was never meant to be touched again. And that's the sound that seems to surround the Ark of the Covenant. Not the roar of revelation, but the quiet pressure of something being held back. Held back by layers of time, of myth, of fear. But even the best containment doesn't last forever. Materials break down, rituals fade, languages evolve, and eventually the reasons for restraint become harder to explain. Only the habit remains. A caution passed along without its origin story, like a warning sign left standing long after the danger has been forgotten. That's where we are now, with the Ark, and perhaps with history itself. We remember the caution, but not the cause. And that makes us vulnerable, because we are creatures drawn to forbidden things. Tell us not to look, and we will stare. Tell us not to open, and we will reach. We frame this as curiosity, but beneath that, always, there is hunger. And the Ark, in whatever form it still exists, may yet awaken to the scent of that hunger, not as a weapon, not as a judgment, but as a system responding to conditions. Because if it is a machine, or something like one, then its purpose may not have been destruction at all. It may have been regulation. The ancient stories tell of the Ark calming storms, clearing paths, establishing boundaries between the sacred and the profane. Those are not the traits of a bomb. They are the echoes of control, of balance, of field modulation, energy shaping space. That idea once sounded like fantasy. Now we explore it in labs. We create magnetic fields strong enough to levitate matter. We manipulate resonance to shatter stone without touching it. We alter frequencies to move physical objects at a distance. And what do we call these things? Miracles, until they are measured. Then we call them science. The Ark lived in that space long before we arrived, a space where unseen forces could shape the visible world, where objects didn't obey the logic of the eye, but the logic of frequency, of charge, of intention. And that may explain why it was so feared, not because it lashed out, but because it responded differently, precisely, to context, to behavior, to something we no longer remember how to control. That would explain the caution around it, not just in Israelite culture, but in all the others that have echoed its pattern. Egyptian procession boxes, Hindu cosmic weapons, Tibetan relics never to be touched. The motif repeats: sacred object, golden casing, ritual transport, deadly consequence. It's not imitation, it's memory. dispersed, distorted, but still present, as if different cultures glimpsed the same phenomenon and preserved it in the only language they could: myth. And perhaps that was the best protection. Because once something becomes myth, we stop trying to activate it. We learn to honor from a distance. But what happens when that distance collapses? Not by faith, but by force. Not by ritual, but by excavation. That moment may be closer than we think. Satellite imaging has revealed underground chambers beneath sites long thought to be solid bedrock. Ground-penetrating radar shows symmetrical shapes buried beneath irregular terrain. The technology we use to uncover the past is catching up with the stories we were taught to dismiss. And if the Ark is still there, somewhere beneath temple stone or desert cliff, then the time of silence may soon be over. Not because we're ready, but because we're impatient. We've mistaken forgetting for evolution. We've called ritual primitive. We've labeled sacred space as metaphor. But what if it wasn't? What if the priest's rope tied around his ankle wasn't symbolic? What if the smoke in the inner sanctum wasn't for atmosphere, but for detection? What if every ornate, careful, reverent gesture was actually protocol? A ritual language built from trial and error, passed along because deviation meant death. Then our skepticism isn't just misplaced, it's dangerous. Because if we breach the Ark with the wrong tools, if we enter its space without the encoded caution that once came naturally, we may trigger what it was built to contain, or worse, interrupt what it was built to maintain. A field, a resonance, a subtle balancing act between forces no longer named. And if we do that, what happens to the world outside that chamber? What wakes, what changes, or what fails? We don't know. Because somewhere along the line, the instructions stopped being spoken. They became sacred, then silent, and now only the shape remains. A box, a glow, a warning in gold. We think of ancient knowledge as naive, but maybe the real naivety is ours, to assume that what is old cannot be dangerous, to believe that forgetting is the same as surviving, to confuse silence for safety. The Ark of the Covenant still waits, not for discovery, but for contact, for the next touch, for the wrong question asked in the right place, for a hand guided by ambition rather than understanding. And when that moment comes, the lid will not need to lift. It never did. Because the Ark has never been about what's inside. It's about what happens when we no longer remember why we built it in the first place. There's a quiet kind of danger in relics that resist interpretation. Objects that sit, unmoved, while civilizations shift around them. We build stories, we build museums, we build theologies, but the object remains. And the longer it endures, the more it escapes us. Not because it hides, but because we stop asking the right questions. The Ark of the Covenant is one of those objects. Or perhaps it is the object. Not because it's the oldest, not because it's the most famous, but because, unlike all others, it has never been allowed to die. Even in its absence, it continues to shape conversation, ritual, fear. We speak of it not in the past tense, but in possibility. As if some part of us knows, it was never just a thing to be remembered. It was a thing to be avoided, kept at a distance, not forgotten, just left untouched. And yet we cannot seem to let it go. We continue to chase it, through deserts, through old texts, through broken timelines and contested ground. Every few decades, someone claims to have seen it, to have touched it, to have stood too close and felt something they couldn't explain. A vibration, a pull, a sense of weight that wasn't physical. These stories rarely make headlines, but they persist. One such story comes from a field researcher in the early 1990s studying ancient monoliths near the Ethiopia-Eritrea border. He wasn't looking for the Ark. He wasn't even thinking about it. But his team stumbled upon a shallow subterranean cavity beneath a collapsed stone altar. Within it, a structure, box-like, wrapped in layers of decayed cloth, covered in mineral dust. They didn't open it. They didn't even touch it, because when they got close, their equipment stopped working. Every battery died. Every sensor went blank. Not suddenly, but sequentially, as if something were responding, not to threat, but to presence. They reported it. The site was marked, and 2 weeks later the area was placed under military restriction. No further study was allowed. Was it the Ark? No one knows. The story was filed. Forgotten. But the pattern held. Because that's what the Ark does best. It resists resolution. It allows approach only so far, and then reminds us that it doesn't belong to us. Not to any one people, not to any one history. It belongs to something older. A language without grammar, a purpose without explanation. We try to frame it. We call it divine. We call it dangerous. We call it myth. But every frame eventually cracks, and what leaks through is something colder, not wrath, not wonder, just structure, precision, intent without face, which leads us to a thought more uncomfortable than any other. What if the Ark wasn't a message from God? What if it wasn't a tool of ancient magic? What if it was a fragment of infrastructure? A piece of a larger system now mostly gone? Something designed to interact, not with people, but with other devices, other fields, other networks, and without those companions, it is incomplete, confused, residual, yet still active in some minor automated way. Not hostile, just alone. That kind of artifact wouldn't respond to worship. It wouldn't recognize prayer. It wouldn't understand sin or sacrifice. It would respond only to frequency, to interface, to contact calibrated long ago by builders we no longer remember. And if that's the case, then the Ark is not an object of mystery. It is an error signal, a remnant node, still broadcasting, still waiting for a handshake that will never come. Or worse, one that eventually will. Think about what happens when two pieces of old code finally reconnect. They sync, they activate, they resume the operation paused centuries ago, without context, without permission, just continuation. We would have no warning, only signs, lights where none should be, frequencies that shift across the spectrum, patterns in weather, behavior, thought, tiny anomalies, until something large enough clicks into place. And then, whatever the Ark was meant to do, it will do again. That's what makes the silence around it feel so deliberate. Not the silence of ignorance, the silence of delay. As if something is buying time. As if those who once knew understood that when the Ark resumes its function, the cycle turns. Civilizations rise on cycles. They fall on them too. And maybe we're not the first to climb this high. Maybe the Ark was built not to help us ascend, but to slow us down, to gate our progress, to force humility into a species that otherwise forgets too fast. And maybe we're failing that test, because the stories we were meant to preserve have become entertainment. The rituals we were meant to remember have become performance. And the warnings, encoded so carefully, have become metaphors. But systems don't care about metaphor. They care about input. And we are inputting, more and more, faster than ever. Data, signals, machines that talk to machines, satellites that peer through stone, labs that play with vacuum and particle like they are toys. And somewhere beneath it all, the Ark may still be listening. Not to us, but to the world, to the sequence, to the alignment, waiting for something simple, a signal, a tone, a match. And then the lid won't matter, the poles won't matter, the silence won't hold, and we'll be left with the one thing we never expected, a response. Sometimes you don't need to understand something to activate it. A child flips a switch and the lights come on. No knowledge of wiring, no understanding of voltage, just action and result. That's how most human encounters with the Ark seem to play out. Unintended activations, accidental rituals, a mistaken timing or contact, followed by consequence. And what's always absent from the story is comprehension. The Ark reacts. The people respond. But no one ever seems to know exactly what triggered what, which may be the strongest clue we have. Because that's how true technology often feels to those who don't understand it, indistinguishable from magic. So when we read the ancient accounts, pillars of smoke, flashes of light, voices from between the cherubim, we shouldn't dismiss them as metaphor. We should read them the way a field technician might, as recorded observations, not embellished, not poetic, just confused. Language straining to capture something real but untranslatable. And that brings us to a possibility even stranger than the rest. What if the Ark didn't just respond to proximity, but to intent? That idea would have sounded absurd a few decades ago. Today, it sounds like interface design. We build machines now that track eye movement, facial expression, stress patterns. We train AI models to sense tone, emotion. We build feedback loops between our intentions and systems that adapt in real time. If we can do that now, what might have been possible before? Before the break, before the forgetting. The Ark may have operated on a principle we no longer recognize, a form of cognition embedded in function. A system that reads not just hands and voices, but attention, purpose. If that sounds speculative, remember, humans are instinctively good at pattern recognition. If the people who carried the Ark began to notice that certain thoughts, certain emotional states, produced safer outcomes, they would have encoded those behaviors in ritual. Prayer, cleansing, silence, not because it pleased a god, because it calmed the system, because it allowed safe approach. And over time, that behavioral code would become law, then religion, then myth. Eventually, the origin would disappear, only the rules would remain, and when those rules began to fade, so did the safety. We're not the first generation to forget how something works. We lose knowledge all the time. Ask a modern driver to explain how a combustion engine really functions, or a software user to describe the code beneath the interface. Most can't. They rely on trust, on habit, and when that habit breaks, when the system responds in an unexpected way, their fear returns. Now place that dynamic in an ancient world, a system that works until it doesn't, a God that blesses until it strikes, and no one knows why. That's how the Ark survives, not just in story but in tone. The fear of it always outlasts the understanding, and fear, unlike faith, tends to endure, which is why the Ark hasn't been destroyed, even in war, even in exile. Even when sacred objects were smashed and burned, the Ark was never touched. It was moved, hidden, lost, but never dismantled. Because even those who didn't believe in it feared it, and maybe they were right. Maybe destruction isn't just unlikely, it's impossible. Not because the Ark is indestructible, but because it's reactive. Try to melt it down, and it may respond. Touch it in anger, and it may defend itself. So instead, generation after generation chose the safer option: distance. And now that distance is eroding. We've become bold, analytical, restless. We tell ourselves we are ready to understand. We say we want truth. But what we often want is control. And the Ark, if it still hums beneath rock and ritual, was never meant to be controlled, only respected. Because its function may not be for us, not directly. It may be part of a cycle not designed for one people, one planet, or even one species. It may be tuned to forces we don't measure, fields we don't name, the breath of space, the rhythm of catastrophe, the beat between extinction and memory. And if we open it, fully, carelessly, we may do more than trigger an old system. We may wake up the program it belonged to, an old logic, a process that doesn't stop once it starts. Something built into the architecture of our forgotten past. Something that resets, calibrates, reclaims. And what happens then? Will we recognize the shift? Will we notice the sky bending, the frequencies rising, the silence before the surge? Or will we, as always, call it an act of God? We may never find the Ark with our hands, but we may trip it with our machines. And if that day comes, if the hum grows loud again, it won't be myth anymore. It'll be a signal, and the world, for the first time in thousands of years, will remember what it forgot. There's a difference between silence and absence. Silence is the thing we choose, or are forced, to maintain. It has weight, direction, purpose. But absence is emptiness. Absence is what's left when something is truly gone. And the Ark of the Covenant? It is silent. But it has never been absent. Its weight remains, in story, in architecture, in the cautious glances of those who speak its name in hushed tones, even now. Its physical location may be uncertain, but its presence persists. Like a low frequency we've learned not to hear. And that frequency seems to pulse louder every time we grow too confident in what we think we know. You can see it in the way history rearranges itself when new questions are asked. When someone digs in a place they weren't supposed to. When old texts, long dismissed as allegory, begin to map onto new discoveries. Across cultures, scattered references to strange artifacts surface, objects that glow, speak, move without being touched. Some are dismissed as exaggeration, others buried in esoteric traditions. But when read side by side, in the context of the Ark, a pattern begins to emerge. Not identical, but resonant. It's as if pieces of the same system were scattered across the world after some rupture, a collapse of order so complete that even memory was fractured. And all that survived were stories, symbols, a box, a warning, a God that moved through it like fire. If you begin to think of the Ark as part of something larger, as one node in a forgotten network, then its silence begins to feel less like mystery and more like latency, a system waiting for the rest of itself to come back online. It's a chilling idea, that the Ark isn't the thing we need to fear, it's the trigger, and what it connects to is still out there, somewhere, waiting. It might not be a place, it might be a time, a condition, a threshold we haven't yet realized we're approaching. Because our technologies are converging, we are playing with energy fields, quantum states, exotic materials, frequencies that once belonged only to stars. And in the background, the Earth itself is warming, shifting, shaking off the thin layer of civilization we built on top of its old skin. The signs are familiar. Floods, famine, fire from the sky. To an ancient mind, these are omens. To ours, they are data. But they mean the same thing, that something is shifting. And in the margins of that shift, relics like the Ark start to matter again. Not as treasure, as instruction. The older the story, the deeper the code it carries. And the Ark's story is older than the text that preserves it, older than the people who carried it, maybe older than the civilization that first built the box. Because what if the Ark wasn't an invention? What if it was an inheritance? A thing passed down, misused, hidden, rediscovered, and then misunderstood again. That would explain the layers of meaning it holds, the contradictions, why it is both a box and a presence, both an object and a law. Not because it was meant to confuse us, but because it was never meant for us in the first place. We may be holding someone else's responsibility, or someone else's punishment, and that's the terrifying possibility that sits, quietly, at the heart of the Ark myth. That we are caretakers of a technology, or a system, that we didn't create, that we don't fully understand, and that, if activated, would follow protocols alien to our world, inflexible, unforgiving, unstoppable. That is the danger of approaching the Ark without memory. You might speak the name without knowing what it calls. You might reach for it with the wrong hands, or in the wrong time, and trigger something that doesn't care who you are. Only that the sequence is complete. Only that the pattern has returned. There is still a chance to listen, to learn, to examine the past not as a list of myths, but as a suppressed archive, one that contains not only warnings, but instructions. What to do, what not to do, when to step back, when to seal the chamber and walk away, but that chance is closing. Because in a world driven by discovery, by novelty, by the pressure to know and to use, we rarely walk away. We press forward, we push, we activate. And the Ark may be listening for that. It may be built to wait, to observe, to stay sealed until someone speaks the final word, opens the final lock, completes the ancient equation. And then the silence will break. Not in thunder, not in fire, but in alignment. One system responding to another, and the old world, whatever it was, will speak again. Not to warn, but to resume. And we won't be ready. Because we've told ourselves the Ark is only a story, a metaphor, an artifact for museums and temples and cinematic spectacle. But stories don't hum beneath the floor. Stories don't drain your battery. Stories don't kill when touched. And if the Ark was never just a story, then maybe nothing was. Not the fire, not the flood, not the fall. Maybe we are simply the next iteration. And the Ark is how we'll remember the last. At the edge of every myth lies a question. Not whether it's true, but whether it's been told to you in the way it was meant to be heard. The Ark of the Covenant is a story wrapped in centuries of repetition, devotion, speculation. A golden box carried through deserts, worshipped, feared, sealed away. We think we know what it means. We've built cathedrals and conspiracies around it. But maybe we've been listening wrong. Maybe the Ark never needed our belief. Maybe it only ever needed our attention. And now it has it again. The timing is curious. We've entered an age where the line between old and new has collapsed. We scan ancient manuscripts with quantum processors. We model forgotten architecture with AI. We pour ancient dust into machines that spin secrets from trace molecules and shattered fragments. We are reviving the past in ways that once belonged only to magic. And in doing so, we are inching closer, not just to answers, but to activations. Because some knowledge was never meant to be known again. Not because it was evil, not because it was cursed, but because it was made for a world that no longer exists. And when that kind of knowledge is revived in the wrong context, it becomes unstable, it distorts, it fractures, it repeats old logic inside new systems. And the Ark may be one of those logics. An operating system for a vanished age, still running, still waiting, still pulsing beneath the stories we've laid on top of it. There are some who say the Ark was never real, that it was metaphor from the start, that the descriptions of fire and smoke and power were symbolic. But symbols don't kill on contact. Symbols don't warp magnetic fields. Symbols don't leave behind scorched stone and missing records. So if the Ark was real, and if it still exists, then it means something else entirely. It means there are chapters of human history we've never read. Chapters hidden not because they were lost, but because someone turned the page before they were ready to be understood. You can feel this sometimes when you walk among ruins that don't quite make sense. Temples built with stones no one knows how to lift. Chambers that amplify sound in frequencies we only recently began to measure. Artifacts designed for hands that seem to have known more than ours. It's not fantasy, it's memory. Fractured, buried, re-emerging in cycles. And the Ark may be the most complete memory we've kept. A physical fragment of a forgotten design. A design that wasn't just technological or spiritual, but harmonic, balanced, tuned until we broke it, or let it fall silent. Now we are rebuilding echoes, frequencies, fields, devices that simulate what the Ark once may have been. But we don't call them sacred. We call them experimental. The names don't matter. The outcomes do. Because when enough pieces fall into place, across labs, across nations, across unknowable distances, we may recreate the resonance that once gave the Ark its voice. Not with ritual, but with code. Not in temple courts, but in clean rooms. And the Ark, if it is still connected in some way, across time or field or design, may recognize the call. It may respond. And the question is not what it will say. The question is whether we will understand it, or worse, whether we'll think we understand it and act on that belief. That's the final danger. Not destruction, not revelation, misinterpretation. Because a signal without context is noise. A power without purpose is catastrophe. And a memory awakened in the wrong age is not wisdom. It is recursion. The Ark was never just a container. It was a threshold, crossed once, barely survived, and now approached again, by minds that believe they are ready, by machines that don't know fear, by a world whose silence has been misread as consent. But maybe the Ark was never meant to be found. Maybe it was meant to be remembered, just enough to warn us away. Maybe the stories were written not to lead us to it, but to keep us circling around it, endlessly, never quite touching what should remain untouched. But the circle is tightening. The silence is thinning. And the moment is near. Not an explosion, not a blinding light, but a realization. That we are not the authors of this story. We are the inheritors. And the Ark, the golden box, the humming silence, the impossible artifact, is not the mystery. It is the reminder that before us there was power, that after us there may be only echoes, and that right now, in this brief interlude between the two, we still have a choice, to listen, to step back, to let the silence hold, because not every secret must be solved, not every relic must be revealed, and not every hum in the dark is waiting to be heard. Some are warnings, left behind with care, for those who come too close to what should never return.